All right, Robert. Why don't you tell us who you are?
Who I am or who I was.
See, look, you mean yeah,
There's a difference.
you're clever, a wise guy. See,
Yes. 'Cause
who is Robert Borelli? If somebody asked that question.
Robert Borelli is a born again Christian who got saved in prison, redeemed by the blood of Jesus, and now lives a life devoted to Jesus Christ.
Okay.
That's who Robert Borelli is.
Okay.
Now, Robert Angle is somebody different.
Okay, so that's a good question. We saw that in the book, Robert Angle, Robert Borelli. So, how did you get the name Borelli?
Okay, going into the witness protection program, after I did my prison time, the marshals picked me up and they fly me to some place. I'm not sure exactly where it is, maybe Maryland, Virginia, somewhere's over there. And they place you in a room and they say you can keep your first name, but you have to change your last name. So they're gonna remake me, basically. Kind of like really being born again, physically, by the government though. So they asked me for a new last name, so I gave them one, and they said, no, that's no good. And that happened like 2 or 3 times. And they said that you're not giving us a good enough name. So I happened to be watching this show while I was in this room, MASH, and it was a MASH unit has to send for a specialist named Dr. Borelli to come to the MASH unit and do this special operation. So when they came in, I gave them the name Borelli, and they came back and they said, that's your name. So that's how Robert Borelli came about, the name.
Interesting, because that name sounds more like Italian mafia than Robert Angle.
Yeah, because my dad was German, not full Italian. That's why I can never get straightened out, made man, because your dad had, at least your dad had to be Italian. So I could never get straightened out. Just like if you ever seen the movie Goodfellas, Jimmy Burke can never get straightened out. But they were going to straighten out Tommy DeSimone, who was underneath Jimmy the Burke because he had an Italian father.
Okay, so for those that don't know the lingo, what does that mean to be straightened out?
Straightened out is be made man in the mafia. In other words, you're inducted into the family, and my family was the Gambino crime family. So you go through an initiation. Now, I never got trained out, so I don't know the concept of it, but Michael Franzese wrote a book called The Blood Covenant, and he explained it more in detail.
So interesting. So if your father wasn't full Italian, you can't be straightened out.
Right.
And so your mother was Italian and your father was German.
Yes.
How were the dynamics of that in the Gambino crime family for you? Did you find it to be where they didn't fully accept you, or what did it look like?
No, because I knew that they fully did. But what bothered me was that I would have to answer to guys that were straightened out who I personally didn't believe should have got straightened out, because I don't think they merited. A lot of things have changed. In the 70s, a lot of things changed on how they straightened out people. Then when you go into the 80s, it was more about guys that brought money in, not the street guys. So a lot of people got offended. A lot of guys that were hanging out in the streets doing the street dirty work wouldn't get straightened out because they weren't big earners, but guys that were big earners would get straightened out, but yet they were not really tough guys, in my opinion. That's just my opinion.
So you had a whole kind of family dynamic going on there within the crime family, based off like bloodlines.
Yes. They started straightening out guys that were their relatives and stuff like that there, and I personally think that was a downfall to the mob, because a lot of those guys, in my personal opinion, I would not have answered that. I would have probably got killed, because there's no way I would have had somebody that I didn't think deserved to get straightened out. I would have to answer to him because he was straightened out and I wasn't.
Interesting. So let's go back a little bit, right? So, we can't assume that people know who the Gambino crime family is. Who are they? How did they get started? What is that about?
Well, I mean, you could go back into the early 1900s when the Italians started coming over. Let me see if I can explain this here and people might understand it. Because everybody knows the mafia, the name mafia. But New York wasn't really mafia. New York was more La Cosa Nostra, which meant our thing. Mafia was really in Sicily. And there's a different dynamics of that there. So, but Carlo Gambino was one of the bosses, and that's how he became the Gambino crime family. You had 5 different families. Carlo Gambino happened to be one of the bosses, and that's what you got the name Gambino crime family.
So this started in Sicily, in Italy,
The mafia, yes.
and then in different families started to come over to New York.
No, because they didn't have it like that. Only New York has 5 families.
Interesting. What are those 5 families?
I don't remember all the bosses' names, to be honest with you. I know you had the Bonanos, the Lucchese's, Genovese, Colombo, and Gambino. I think somewhere's around that.
And is it the same today, or is it a little different today?
No, it's still the same today.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and so how did you individually get involved with the Gambino crime?
As a young kid, in my neighborhood, we had street gangs. It was fairly big. It was pretty big in them days. There's a movie that came out, I think, in the 80s called Warriors. And it was about the street gangs of Brooklyn. Now, a lot of it's factional, Hollywood made it more glamorous, but not so much truthful. But basically, in Brooklyn, New York, we had gangs. So if you had 5 or 6 guys would hang out, like I was part of the F&R. I lived on Fulton Street right off of Rockaway Avenue, and we hung out on Fulton and Rockaway, so we called the F&R. Then you had a group called the Railroad Boys. They hung out in Bushwick on the railroad tracks, so we called them the Railroad Boys. So you keep doing that back and forth there. And so you had gangs. Every 4 blocks that you walked out of your neighborhood, you were going into somebody else's neighborhood. And if you went in somebody else's neighborhood, you were messing with their turf, so to speak. And that's when the friction used to start.
So, okay, you were first in a kind of like a youth kind of street gang called the FNR.
Right.
And then that led to what affiliation to the Gambino crime family?
Well, because, I maybe I didn't explain myself. Part of the Gottis was part of the FNR crew. They were a little bit older than me. When they got married, or one of them, we became the FNR crew, and I hung out with John Gotti's youngest brother, Vinny Gotti, and that was part of it. So they had a club. When these guys got a little bit older, they had a club right down the block from me. Now, I didn't know as a young kid that my neighborhood's ran by the Gambino crime family. But as I got older, so I was one of the tough kids in the neighborhood, and the mob guys that hung out in these social clubs kind of took a liking to me. And they would make me go in the club, and I'd shoot pool with them sometimes. They'd have a card game, and I'd serve a sandwich here and there, a drink, make a couple of tips for myself. And that's how I started graduating with that there. And Gene Gotti, at that point in time, was kind of like my idol. He was my older sister, Betty's friend. They hung out together. And then he got involved with the mob through his brother John Gotti, and he became my idol in the neighborhood. So I started hanging out with him a little bit when he would come around. So that's kind of like how I got involved with hanging out in the social club.
So interesting. So you were friends with the Gotti brothers. They were FNR gang.
Yes.
And that's how you got into the Gambino crime family.
Well, not at that age, but as I grew older, I kind of followed that lifestyle. As a young kid, some people want to be doctors, some people want to be firemen, some people want to be a policeman. I want to be a gangster. In my age, growing up, most of the movies you've seen were from my neighborhood and was about gangsters. So if you looked at James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, when they did these movies, it seemed like they got all the attention, they got all the respect, they got all the pretty girls, they had all the money, they had the lifestyle that I would want for myself without having to get an education to get it. So I followed that trend. I wanted the pretty girl, I wanted the money, and I didn't want to go to school.
How old were you in FNR? What was that age group?
I'd say probably from 12 to about 16 years old.
You mentioned the Railroad Boys. Is that the same thing as the Bushwick Boys? Are they the same clique?
That would kind of be the same thing, but you might have like the Railroad Boys, then you had the Bushwick Boys. Might have been 2 different crews at that time. I don't remember.
Is that an African American crew?
No, they were white guys. They were white guys.
Okay. So I have a question. Who is Nicky Carozzo? How did this guy impact your life?
That's a touchy name for me. Nicky was the guy that mentored me. I was on the lam for a murder case, and he was helping my family hide me out. And he was my mentor. Nicky was like my dad. Nicky became my father and grew me in that lifestyle.
So I can see some emotion associated with that name. Why?
Well, because I loved Nicky. I loved Nicky, but things just didn't work out. And obviously, later on in life, I was called to testify against them. I didn't have to because they all took pleas. So it still hurts a little bit.
That must be tough. You said you were on the lam. Again, for those that don't know what that means, what does it mean to be on the lam?
Running away from the law. I was wanted for murder. A fight that happened when I was like 18 years old. Somebody got killed in a bar fight, and they were wanting me for it. And my friend's dad, who was one of the big bosses in the neighborhood, me and his godson were wanted for that crime, and they kind of took us and hid us out, so this way we didn't get locked up. And part of the transition for me was that Nicky and them took care of us a little bit when we were on the lam.
18 years old. I mean, it's just interesting. I'm kind of curious a little bit about the youth gang culture in New York. It seems, I grew up in Southern California, and a lot of these street gangs, these kids get in at 12, 13, 14 years old. And I mean, it's what is it about, for these kids that make it so appealing to join these kind of small gangs, and how did that impact you as a youth?
Well, I always examined that there a lot, especially today. Like, what was it? What happened in my life? I mean, I could probably pinpoint a couple of things, but I think I say it this way: my youngest brother was born 8 years after me, so I was the baby of the family for 8 years, and as the baby of the family, I got a lot of attention. When he was born, that attention was put on him because he was now the baby. And I think I was just craving for the attention and acceptance. And, just in the streets back in Brooklyn, the guys played ball together. We did everything together. So we just hung out. And when things were different, like when we were just going to hang out, not playing ball, we would hang out on the stoop and, just do stupid things, rank on one another and all those kind of things. So you kind of develop where people say, oh, they're part of the FNR because we hung out on Fulton and Rockaway. And then when you left your neighborhood, like you had mentioned, and I think I'm going ahead of you on certain things, but there were certain neighborhoods that I want to make sure I say it the right way. Not so much prejudice, but you had different portions of the neighborhood were for different types of people.